Welcome to the Disinfo Detox, where we cut through the noise to bring you the stories that matter. Today we're tackling a growing crisis, fake science and the scientific illiteracy of media makers who shape the public's understanding of critical issues. As the courts wrestle with President Trump's efforts to cut funding for scientific research and health officials sound the alarm about rising measles cases, misinformation and misrepresentation of scientific research continue to proliferate, leaving the public vulnerable to bad information. To help us break it all down, we're joined by Wynn Tranfield, a STEM librarian at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a place I know well, who specialized in spotting and debunking scientific disinformation. Wynn, welcome to Disinfo Detox.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give folks kind of an idea, what is it a STEM librarian does for those of us who are not initiated?
Sure. So librarians hold many different roles. For me personally, my colleagues, we provide instruction to undergraduate and graduate students around the university. We help with research questions, research assistance in general. Colleagues do search strategies for systematic reviews. And we also keep our ear to the ground in terms of what the scholarly communication landscape looks like, where it's headed, where the issues are. So this is where, what brings us to the science's misinformation issue, where we're getting predatory journals, fake journals, and a proliferation of articles that purport to be peer-reviewed, but really don't follow our, standard, high-value peer review that we come to expect.
Yeah, let's delve a little bit into that, because I think this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast. I know we have a common friend here who was nice enough to push us along to this episode. Mm-hmm. But you said a couple things there that I think some folks, certainly who are not in academia, but even folks who are, may not understand. And so I wonder if you could break this down, and just so our audience knows why I'm asking you this question. I sent you a couple of these clips, and this was a big critique of mine during COVID and the so-called vaccine debate, and even more recently. But we've seen figures like, Jimmy Dore reference a study from people at Yale.
Everybody's making a big deal out of this new study. I don't know if you're aware of it at home, but Yale released a paper, and they found that the vaccine causes lots of the same symptoms long COVID does. And Yale scientists who risk careers to publish bombshell COVID vaccine study issue message to shots victims.
Or I saw another clip recently of Joe Rogan citing a study he saw online.
Not only that, if you talk to virologists, they say you never vaccinate during a pandemic because it encourages variants. I posted that on Twitter, the study on Twitter, and so many people were attacking me. I'm like, hey, I didn't write the study. This is a study that shows that when you vaccinate with a non-sterilizing vaccine during a pandemic, it encourages variants. And that's what happened.
Just because folks are out there, and I know, I don't know how in tune you are with the digital culture, but there's also the... clearly a lot of, support or believers of RFK Jr. online. And he wrote his book on vaccines. And whenever he's pressed on it, he always makes this defense that, well, look, I forget how many hundreds he claims of peer-reviewed studies to support what I say in this book. I don't know the answer to this question. This is not a loaded question. I'm asking you. Have there been any subsequent studies, even if they're in weak peer-reviewed journals, that have made some connection between vaccines and autism, or has nobody since Wakefield really attempted to publish that in a peer-reviewed journal, as far as you know?
No, there haven't been any studies. And so, we were talking about these particular studies, like connecting the COVID vaccine to they're using vaccine injury syndrome. It's not a medically recognized term really still, but like that cluster of symptoms, those haven't really been published in highly reputable journals either. The Yale study that you'll reference, that's a preprint, has yet to be published. These are all really small populations. So the pattern is they're just looking at very small subsets of populations. There have been studies that have looked at larger populations. in those larger population studies, not connecting to autism, nothing's been able to connect to autism. Autism was diagnosed, like decades and decades before the MMR vaccine was even invented. So no, but there have been other population-based studies that have connected vaccines to like other syndromes. The H1N1 vaccine is a great example. So there was an outbreak in '76, and the vaccine caused some drama then, but there was another outbreak in 2009, and that was a really great opportunity for scientists to study the actual impacts. And I think they found in the case of the 2009 vaccination for H1N1 that the vaccine caused an increase of one diagnosed instance of Guillain-Barré syndrome per million above baseline. So just like incredibly small, and not large enough to really outweigh the benefits of the vaccine itself either.
Okay, and then I want to continue talking a little bit about COVID, and then talk about some of the more recent discussions about Ebola prevention funding and other things. But before we do get into that, you've mentioned this a couple of times, and actually I came across this while doing research on COVID media narratives. Do you want to explain what a preprint or prepub is, what their purpose is for academics, and why those in media should not use them to write up news stories? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So preprints have been, they really came to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic, because another thing about peer review is it can take many, many months, sometimes years, to push an article through the peer reviewed process. And during the pandemic, we needed lots of information fast. So more and more scholars were publishing on preprint servers. Preprint servers are used by researchers to get their work out before the work is published in a peer-reviewed journal. So typically what is published on a preprint server, it's likely going to change or be evaluated if it eventually gets published. They were originally created to disseminate the work while an article was going through the peer-reviewed process, but they kind of have been appropriated by folks who want to get their work out there and use it as a scholarly publishing platform without any expectation or follow through on the peer-reviewed journal front. So the work that's on a preprint server hasn't been evaluated. However, we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, and now that news media likes to use preprint servers as a scholarly article or a study found, without adding the caveat that this hasn't been evaluated by peers, it hasn't been validated, there's no context, sort of thing. So,
and we saw that, right? Yeah, and we saw that right in the Jimmy Dore clip I sent you.
Everybody's making a big deal out of this new study. I don't know if you're aware of it at home, but Yale released a paper.
He cites this preprint study that he says is evidence of I forget what is it called, vaccine injury syndrome or something like that.
Yeah, and the other guest on the Jimmy Dore show was talking about how they couldn't get their article published and no one wanted to publish it.
He's the doctor who treated me originally for my vaccine injury and diagnosed me correctly, and prescribed lots of treatments that helped me. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Yo. How are you?
but we did find it in all 4 vaccine companies and in the vaccine injured patients when we looked at the spike.
So this Yale study, so you couldn't get published, but the Yale can because they're from Yale.
And it was on a preprint server as well. I looked at that article. Maybe it wasn't a good article.
Okay, let me ask you a couple. These can be kind of lightning round questions. I don't need you to be an expert on all these if you don't want to. But during COVID, I was hosting another podcast, and week to week, I would bring different people from the scientific community in to address some of the things going around online. I think we had a whole episode about there were people online who thought like cocaine was a good remedy for COVID, things like that. So we would interrogate some of these narratives, but on a much more serious note, I think there's a misremembering of the history of COVID. And I want to ask you about a couple of things. So one of them is lockdowns. Now, my understanding, you tell me if I'm wrong, and this comes from reading some reporting that, lockdowns were kind of initially tried in the United States during the flu pandemic of the early 20th century. And they were sort of assumed that the lockdowns were a mistake. They didn't solve the problems. But then we got computer modeling in the late 20th century that said, no, actually, if you had shut down earlier and done a total shutdown, lockdowns would have worked. And so by the time COVID hit, those who were familiar with those models were advocating for lockdowns for that reason. But my understanding is it's not, you tell me, my understanding is that it's not the lockdowns, quote unquote, didn't work. It's that we never actually did lockdowns. You can't have some states locked down, some not. You can't have frontline workers and some hospitals open, but others not. You can't have international travel. Those are not lockdowns. So I have that right, or what would you say about that?
I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think we share the memory there where it wasn't a complete and utter lockdown. And there were always subsets of the population that were unable or unwilling to be restricted. So.
Yeah, and then it became a weird culture war issue, because if you did a lockdown and it worked, presumably it'd be a handful of weeks, but instead months, years later, some are locking down, some are not. It became like a culture war show, right?
Yeah, and I mean masking as well. So that was a big issue where a lot of folks said, there's no evidence that masks work. And that became, I think that links back to evidence-based practice where there wasn't a randomized controlled trial that evaluated mask use, but it really wouldn't make sense that there would be a randomized controlled trial. If there's an airborne pathogen, people wear a mask because it would be unethical to run a trial without masks if there is a known airborne pathogen. But there wasn't a study. So
yeah, and so this brings me to another area that I was interested to talk to you about. And I should say at the outset that I'm someone who was supportive of a lot of the COVID response in a lot of ways. So this is not coming from someone who rejects everything, but I did have some criticisms, and one person in particular I want to talk about is Anthony Fauci, because I think Fauci would often give policy proposals to the public and then introduce them as science. And I think in the long run, that did problems for the scientific community. And what I'm talking about specifically is early on in the pandemic, he said something about how you didn't need to wear masks. And then later on, he said you do need to wear masks. And he admitted he lied the first time because he was worried about running out of PPE. Or when he was out in 2021, going out to Black communities to get more folks to accept the vaccine, PBS recorded him telling people that they would have no symptoms if they took it. And then that changed. As someone who was vaxxed twice and had COVID 3 times, I can tell you there's symptoms.
Well, I heard that it doesn't cure it, and it doesn't stop you from getting it.
No.
So
on the very, very, very rare chance that you do get it, even if you're vaccinated, you don't even feel sick. It's like you don't even know you got infected.
So what do you make of that distinction? Because I do think some of the critics of science, and air quotes, I think they're really criticizing folks like Fauci, who are policymakers that kind of establish themselves in the scientific community, where real scientists I talked to had more nuanced views. I remember one I spoke to said, yeah, there's always some, side effects for a tiny percent with any vaccine, but it's going to look larger because we've never had this many millions of people take a vaccine all at once. But like, so scientists were saying stuff like that to me, but then the dogma from media was, no, don't question it. It's 100% safe. There's no issues, no complications. And I think in the long run, that narrative hurt the scientific community. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think right now there's a crisis of trust, where many people have good reason to be mistrustful of the scientific community and their doctors because they've heard a lot of different stories and they have been hurt and have received a lot of confusing messaging. And the anti-vax community has been organized and has been doing this really, really well. And their messaging is, you've been hurt. It's understandable. Like, not trusting them is understandable because they're lying to you. You can trust us. And here we have evidence and we will explain it to you in a way that makes sense to you. Their messaging is great. The scientific community, shockingly, messaging terrible. And I think people have a lot of good reason to mistrust at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, and let's talk about one other villain, why that might be. I always got a kick out of this that while so many kind of left-leaning folks during the pandemic were saying things like trust the science and kind of blindly supporting Anthony Fauci, one of the best-selling books is on like the Sackler family and the empire of pain. So can you also talk about the ways in which big pharma also, I think, contributes to a lot of skepticism about scientific research, because a lot of people, I don't think, make the distinction between like kind of the academic research of science versus big pharma. Have you seen that in your work, and can you speak a little bit to that?
I mean, that's an evaluation key. This is something that I try and reinforce to students too. When you're looking at a scientific article and a randomized controlled trial, look at their conflict of interest and statement and look at the authors and do some Googling, because things usually aren't buried too deeply, and see where the financial interest is and what kind of story that tells. And that's part of evaluation. That's one of the keys. So if all of these new vaccine studies that we were talking about, the Dill vaccine, if we look at who these doctors are and where they're getting funding and what they're affiliated with, they're 2 steps away from financial gain from a new test that will see if you have this vaccine syndrome that they have invented, or a class action lawsuit, or they're 2 steps away from financial gain. And it's going to be complicated, and there's going to be gray area, and that's uncomfortable, especially for people who aren't scientists or doctors or experts. So I think this is where like the media can do a better job messaging. There can be better science communicators that can bridge that gap. But right now, the anti-vaxxers are doing a great job and not necessarily disclosing financial interests or finding issues with that. And
okay, let's talk about the present, because some of those very people are in the cabinet of the new administration. So we've seen some interesting things. So I want to get your take on this, and I'll just kind of throw these at you, and you can respond to any or all of it. But we saw cuts to Ebola prevention made at the federal government level. This is something that Elon Musk eventually took credit for and said he fixed it, but a lot of reporting has said no, the money has not gone back to Ebola prevention. And then, we saw the Trump administration try to cut NIH funding, which is critical for a lot of folks in the scientific community, particularly in academia and elsewhere. And then this part I would also want to get your take on is there's all these reports about these measles outbreaks. And so I wonder, just collectively kind of looking at where we're at now and knowing the problems with media and big pharma and the Anthony Fauci's of the world that you've already kind of covered, what are you paying attention to? What are you thinking about? What should people out there who are listening be paying attention to?
I usually tell students to be aware of really sensational claims, really sensational headlines. The Daily Mail headline that was in the video, like that one, classic example of a sensational headline. If someone's trying to draw a conclusion or draw a line based on one study that has yet to be peer reviewed, it's misleading. Science is a conversation, it's a process. So any conclusion should have, more than one study behind it. And there's going to be nuance as well. So just be very, very wary of anything overly sensational. Look at more than one news source. That's always a great one. Like, what are other news sources saying about it? Compare notes and follow the money as well.
Okay, and I think I know how you're going to respond to this, but I have to ask you nonetheless. There's a lot of discourse online about, and this predated Trump's inauguration, but was after the election. I noticed a lot of right-wing echo chambers were discussing how they think, I assume, that the COVID pandemic was somehow like a plot by the deep state against Trump. And so, either leaked from the lab or was pushed out of the lab as a way to create the context, get rid of Trump. I don't know all the details. I'm not immersed into the baseless conspiracies of that space. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is because they're now saying they think like measles or Ebola is going to be another example of that basically left-wingers and big pharma are creating this fake pandemic as a way to, I guess, theoretically profit or reestablish political dominance over the MAGA movement. What do you say that as a scientist? What can you say to say that like this measles is no joke, or why are you so convinced that the measles outbreak is a legitimate problem and outbreak, and why should others?
Oh boy. Well, I will say it's really a shame to see public trust in science be so severely damaged, but I'm not really up on the Ebola virus, I will say that, but I think you can look at year by year evidence for outbreaks and outbreak patterns in measles. Like, there's still data available on the CDC website. I don't know how long that will last. We've seen government data, especially CDC data, disappear the last month or so. But right now there is still, this outbreak data available, and you can compare years, and that tells a story for you as well.
Awesome. Wynn Tranfield, it's a great interview. Thank you so much for being on the Disinfo Detox. And thank you so much to all of you for tuning in.
Hey Detoxers. We hope you enjoyed that clip. If you want to check out more, you can find full episodes and other clips on YouTube, as well as on all the major podcast platforms, and of course, by subscribing on Substack at nolanhigdon.substack.com. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. It really helps us out, and it keeps those tech overlords happy. See you next time. Detox complete.